As I spent a Sunday evening watching my son explore his playmat, I wondered, what would his life look like in medieval times? Our current understanding of childhood is generally derived from our own experiences. A parent wants to give their child a better childhood than their own. But our childhood is and was determined by our culture, social standing, and the epoch in which we were raised. Living in the information age, we can easily spin up ChatGPT and ask, is it normal for my baby to want to eat every hour? Is it normal for my baby not to crawl yet? But this was obviously not the case throughout history. If we rewind the clock by about 200 years, we find it common to see children of lower social classes working in factories and mines. During the 19th century, we see restrictions come in place to how much children could work. For example, in the United Kingdom, the Mines Act of 1842 forbade children under the age of 10 to perform underground work, which means they could work above ground. In 1841, in France, children aged 8 to 12 were restricted to working 8 hours per day. But one wonders, what happened when you turned 13, or to what extent were these laws enforced? It was only in the early 20th century that compulsory schooling laws throughout Europe and the United States made it illegal for children to work instead of attending school. However, school was compulsory in most cases until the age of around 14 or 15. It was only in the latter half of the 20th century that this age was bumped up. Now, this all sounds horrible. I mean, it's good that we developed into a more free and less exploitative society, but were things worse for children during medieval times? So, who was considered a child? Adulthood and its rites of passage were considerably different during medieval times. At what point does one stop being a child and become an adult? A disputed notion is that children were considered as little adults. Historian Philippe Ariès wrote in Centuries of Childhood, "As soon as the child has been weaned and could live without the constant solicitude of his mother, his nanny, or his cradle rocker, he belonged to adult society." However, in more recent times, historians reject this notion, stating that there is evidence in the historical record which proves there was a more complex view on what it meant to be a child. Medieval scholars themselves split childhood into 3 distinct phases: infantia, pueritia, and adolescentia. Infantia is defined as the age of 0 to 7, where a child is seen as helpless, lacking reason, and having a full dependence on adults. Historian Shulamith Shahar describes in Childhood in the Middle Ages, "The view of childhood up to the age of 7 as a period in which the human being is helpless and totally dependent on adults is reflected in the remarks of preachers and authors of confessors' manuals who exhorted parents to take good care of their children, who were under their full responsibility to the age of 7. Now, pueritia, the age of 7 to 14 for boys, and 7 to 12 for girls, is considered the age of reason, where children can understand the concept of morality and follow practical instruction. This phase is seen as transitory, meaning children would receive formal responsibilities and should fulfill certain societal expectations. And finally, we have adolescentia, the age of 14 to 21 for boys and 12 to 21 for girls. The age where children could marry, enter apprenticeship, and take up more adult roles. By the way, did you notice that each phase is 7 years? This is because medieval scholars like Isidore of Seville followed the thinking of Greek philosophers like Hippocrates and Aristotle, who believed that the human life developed in cycles of 7. In addition, the number 7 holds significant importance in Christianity. 7 days of creation in Genesis, 7 sacraments, 7 virtues, and 7 deadly sins. And finally, did you know that if asked to choose a number between 1 to 10, most people pick 7? Well, this has nothing to do with history, but it's a cool little factoid. Anyways, this is how medieval scholars describe childhood. But since most people living in medieval times did not read, they could not reflect on the works of people like Isidore of Seville. So let's take a look at legal accountability between adult and child. If we were to believe the previously quoted Philippe Ariès, who said that a child who doesn't need constant supervision and care is basically an adult, Did the law hold a prepubescent child equally accountable as a 30-year-old? Philippe de Remy wrote in the late 13th century, "Sometimes a child of 10 or 12 is so corrupt and evil, and if such a child commits a murder of his own free will, or as an agent of some other person, he is to be executed. But he will not be punished by lopping of limbs or execution for the crime of theft, but will rather be pardoned because of his age." This shows that children were given leniency in the legal context up to a certain degree, meaning there was a legal differentiator present. Now, if we follow this logic, children in adolescencia, the ages 14 to 21, have pretty much the same legal accountability as those of 21 or older. So what sets them apart from full-fledged adults? Well, adults over the age of 21 could enter contracts. They could sue, they can serve as witness, and can inherit fiefdoms. Inheritance law, though, was a little bit complex, but was possible under certain circumstances starting at the age of 15. So now that we have established that children during the Middle Ages were, well, considered children, at least until the age of 14, what did they do? What did their life look like? The daily life of a child. It is a common misconception that the parent-child relationship was detached due to high infant mortality rate. Parents with access to rudimentary form of medicine, heat in the winter, and that provided ample rest for the mother increased the chances of having a young child survive its first few years. However, even though attachment to children was present, peasants still saw their children as economic assets. Very young children within the peasant class who lived close to subsistence would help their parents with their daily tasks. They would weed, they would plant, care for livestock, and in cases, help with plowing. Children would also help their mothers within the household and help raise their younger siblings. Obviously, since most people couldn't read back then, education was limited to observing their parents' daily procedures and learning by doing. Funny enough, toys for peasant children reflected their future roles, including small plows, carts, and dolls. Imagine exchanging your kids' wooden blocks right now with a child-friendly Excel simulator. So now let's leave the countryside and head towards the city. Urban children of bourgeoisie and craftsmen had a different life. After their infancia phase, so upon reaching the age of 7, children could begin an apprenticeship under a master. Usually, if a parent was not a master of their craft, parents would enter into an apprenticeship contract with a craftsman, and the apprentice would then have to pay a fee to join the associated guild. We'll delve further into apprenticeships in another video. If you are fortunate enough to be born into a wealthy urban family, you could attend petty school. This consisted mostly of learning basic literacy, arithmetic, and religion. This, however, was mostly reserved for young boys, as urban girls were expected to help their mother with domestic tasks such as cooking, spinning, and childcare. Since giving a blacksmith's son a mini anvil might seem as a logical toy, children in urban areas often enjoyed more communal games with other children in the neighborhood, including ball games and hopscotch, things like that. Children of nobility didn't really have it easy either, relative to modern days of course. At the age of 7, young boys were commonly sent to serve as pages in other noble households. A page is a boy learning about knighthood and underwent physical training, learned how to read, learned about religion, and learned about the chivalric virtues. The chivalric virtues centered around the 10 commandments of chivalry. Obey the church, defend the weak, love your country, be brave, have a merciless war against infidels, follow feudal duties in accordance with the law of God, never lie, be generous, and be the champion of good. Once a boy turns 14, entering adolescencia, a boy could become a squire. Noble girls, on the other hand, received a domestic and courtly education. This included needlework, music, and religion. In addition, noble daughters learned how to manage servants and help prepare court for guests. Play and recreational time for boys revolved around toy swords and mock tournaments, whereas girls played with dolls, again reflecting their future occupations. Finally, we should discuss clerical children. Some noble families dedicated one of their sons to the church, believing they could curry both earthly and divine favor. However, commoners also gave up their children to the church, since this was often the only way for a commoner to gain social advancement. At the age of 7, when boys entered monastic school, they learned Latin, liturgy, and scripture. Young boys were subjected to a life of discipline, which was harsh, as they believed it would instill humility and devotion to God. Their day was riddled with prayer and physical labor. Depending on a monastery, labor would vary from either doing some field work or sweeping and cleaning. Leisure and play were restricted to, that's right, scripture, reading, again. As described by Hugh of Lincoln, frequently when my young companions were at their usual sports, he would rebuke me mildly and with parental kindness, saying, "My dear son, do not be infected by the foolish and aimless levity of your comrades." He would add, little Hugh, I am educating you for Christ. Play is not for you." Thank you for watching this episode. Please like and subscribe. Check out my sources below and see you in the next one.